For 26 years, the transport kept its secrets at the bottom of a quarry. When the hatch finally groans open, the diver's light finds not what was lost, but something that was never supposed to be there. Alex Kincaid stood at the edge of the Greer limestone quarry, the air carrying the damp, earthy scent of disturbed stone and deep water. A weak, pre-dawn light filtered through the skeletal arms of the surrounding sycamores, painting the placid surface of the water in shades of slate and mercury. He ran a gloved hand over the smooth, cold casing of his rebreather, the silence of its closed-circuit system, a stark contrast to the open-circuit bubbles that had filled his ears during that final failed rescue. That memory was a constant companion, a low hum beneath the surface of his thoughts, the ghost of a hand slipping from his own in the violent North Atlantic. It was the reason he preferred the silent, deliberate work of salvage, of finding things that couldn't slip away. The quarry was a place of local legend, a wound in the earth that had filled with rain and groundwater, swallowing secrets. 26 years ago, it had swallowed a ghost story whole. He could recite the details by heart, the same details the nation had obsessed over in the summer of 1999. 3 United States Marshals, Senior Marshal Thomas Slade, a man on the cusp of retirement, Marshal David Miller, the young, ambitious family man, and Marshal Robert Chen, the quiet, methodical firearms expert, had vanished. They were transporting a federal witness, a shadowy figure named Julian Croft, whose testimony was set to dismantle a powerful crime syndicate. Their armored transport, a modified GMC van designated True 7, had last been seen turning onto a stretch of 2-lane blacktop that dead-ended 5 miles past the quarry entrance. Then, nothing. No radio call, no wreckage, no ransom demand. Just 4 men and a rolling steel vault, erased from the world. Alex cinched the webbing on his harness, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. The initial search had been one of the largest in the state's history, a sprawling, desperate effort that turned up nothing but dead ends and conspiracy theories. The public imagination ran wild, speculating about everything from a professional ambush by the mob to a clean extraction by a foreign intelligence agency. The vehicle was presumed to be at the bottom of a river or hidden in some remote chop shop, its occupants long since buried in unmarked graves. But a recent geological survey, using advanced ground-penetrating radar to map the quarry for a potential drainage project, had found an anomaly. A large, unnaturally dense and rectangular mass was resting on a ledge 150 feet below the surface, obscured from sonar by a thick layer of silt and a tangle of submerged trees. It was the right size and shape for TRU 7. He checked his dive computer, the screen glowing with crisp, reassuring numbers. The state police and a pair of tight-lipped FBI agents stood a respectful distance away, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun. They were the ones who had called him, the specialist with a reputation for handling difficult, sensitive recoveries. They saw a tool, an expert operator, to get them their evidence. They didn't see the man who still felt the phantom weight of a lost life on his soul, who saw every descent as a chance to reclaim something, anything, from the crushing indifference of the depths. The water in the quarry was cold, visibility would be near zero in the silt bed, and the vehicle itself was a tangled question mark of corroded metal and unknown hazards. Alex felt the familiar knot of apprehension and resolve tighten in his gut. This was his element now, not the chaotic, unforgiving ocean, but the contained, silent mystery of a man-made lake. He pulled his hood over his head, the neoprene muffling the world, leaving only the sound of his own steady, controlled breathing. He was going down to find a truck, but as he looked at the dark, unblinking eye of the water, he knew he was looking for more than that. He was looking for an answer, a finality that had been denied to 4 families for over a quarter of a century. The legend of the vanished Marshals was about to be dredged into the light, and he would be the one to do it. Every piece of equipment he wore was a testament to control, to mitigating risk, to ensuring that what went down came back up. It was a promise he had made to himself, a silent vow forged in failure. He would not fail this time. The dead had waited long enough for their story to be told, and the water, he knew, always held its secrets loosely for those who knew how to ask. He took one last look at the sky, then turned and walked to the water's edge, his fins slapping softly against the stone. The mystery of True 7 was waiting. The entry was a gentle shock, a sudden encompassing cold that seeped through the seals of his dry suit. The world above vanished, its sounds and colors replaced by the uniform green-gray tint of the quarry. Bubbles from his entry, the only ones his rebreather would release, danced around his faceplate before racing for a surface that already felt a world away. He did a final check of his gauges, his movements economical and practiced. Depth, 10 feet, all systems nominal. The only sound was the faint rhythmic click of his gear and the soft whisper of gas circulating through the closed loop of his breathing apparatus. It was a profoundly isolating sound, the sound of his own life support. He began his descent, a slow, controlled fall through the water column. The sun, now fully above the horizon, sent weak, fractured rays spearing into the depths, illuminating a universe of suspended particles. Specks of algae, fine dust from the quarry walls, and the ghosts of long-dead leaves drifted past his face plate like lazy constellations. He passed through the thermocline at 40 feet, a shimmering, oily barrier in the water where the temperature plummeted. The cold became a heavier, more insistent presence, a weight against his skin. Below this line, the light gave up, and the world dissolved into a featureless, oppressive dark. Alex switched on his primary light, a high-intensity beam that cut a sharp white cone through the blackness. His light swept across the sheer vertical face of the quarry wall. It was a landscape of brutalist angles and pale stone, scarred by the tools that had carved it from the earth decades ago. He could see the drill marks, the blast lines, a topography of industrial violence now softened by a thin carpet of algae. He kept one hand near the wall, a point of reference in the disorienting void. His depth gauge crept downward. 70 feet, 90 feet, 120. The pressure was a palpable force now, a gentle, insistent squeeze on his entire body. It was a feeling he was intimately familiar with, the embrace of a hostile environment that demanded constant respect and attention. He remembered the briefing, the geological survey images showing the target on a wide ledge at 150 feet. The ledge was an old mining terrace, a step in the quarry's inverted ziggurat. Below it, the bottom dropped away into another 300 feet of black, debris-strewn water. If the truck had overshot the ledge, it would be effectively irrecoverable. But the radar had been clear. It was there, waiting in the silt that had patiently gathered over it for 26 years. He angled his descent away from the wall, moving toward the coordinates stored in his dive computer's navigation system. The beam of his light now probed an empty, infinite darkness. There was nothing to see but the backscatter of his own illumination, the water thick with suspended sediment. Then a shape began to resolve itself at the extreme edge of his light. At first it was just a subtle disruption in the darkness, a form that was too large, too geometric to be natural. It was a shadow darker than the surrounding water. He slowed his descent, his heart rate ticking up a single, steady beat. The form grew, solidifying as he approached. It was massive, a hulking rectangular beast half buried in the silt. He had found it. 2-7. It rested on the ledge at a slight angle, its front end tilted downward as if it had nosed into the soft bottom on impact. The thick blanket of reddish-brown silt covered its roof and hood, and long strands of algae clung to its sides like tattered funeral shrouds. Alex circled it slowly, keeping a safe distance. The vehicle was unnervingly intact. The tires were still inflated, though distorted by the pressure. The windows were dark, opaque squares, reflecting his light back with a flat, dead gleam. There was no obvious sign of an explosion or a firefight, no shredded metal or spider-webbed glass. It just looked parked, as if someone had driven it carefully off the edge of the quarry and let it sink into the cold, silent water. This was wrong. An ambush, a violent shootout, would have left scars. The truck should have been peppered with bullet holes mangled from a crash. This silent, placid scene felt more like a burial than a crime scene. It felt deliberate. He moved closer, his light tracing the seam of the driver's side door. The stillness of the wreck felt alien, a pocket of preserved time. He hovered over the roof, looking down at the silent machine, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the water temperature. The story everyone knew about the vanished Marshals, the story of a violent, chaotic end, was already starting to unravel. The silt surrounding the transport vehicle was a deep, soft trap, disturbed into billowing clouds by the gentle thrust of his fins. Alex knew that anything ejected from the vehicle during its descent would be buried here. The official procedure was to photograph and document the exterior first, to establish a baseline before any interaction. He began a systematic clockwise survey, his video camera mounted to his helmet recording every detail, his primary light sweeping in slow, methodical arcs. The paint on the truck was blistered and peeling in places, exposing the raw, oxidizing steel beneath. The government seal on the passenger door was still faintly visible, a ghost of an eagle and shield beneath a quarter-century of grime. Everything was coated in a fine, velvety layer of sediment that puffed away at the slightest disturbance. He worked with a surgeon's precision, his movements calculated to create as little turbidity as possible. The silence of the deep was absolute, amplifying the importance of every small detail. He rounded the front of the vehicle, its massive grille giving it the look of a monstrous open mouth frozen in a silent scream. The headlights were shattered, two empty black eyes staring into the abyss. The hood was latched tight. He continued his circle, moving along the passenger side, his light playing over the sealed windows of the rear compartment where the prisoner Julian Croft would have been held. There were no marks, no scratches, no signs of forced entry. It was a sealed tomb, a perfect time capsule. But a time capsule of what? Exactly. The absence of violence was more unnerving than 100 bullet holes would have been. It spoke of control, of a plan executed without resistance. It didn't fit the narrative of 3 seasoned marshals being overwhelmed in a sudden brutal attack. As he neared the rear of the truck, his light caught something just at the edge of the main debris field, about 10 feet from the driver's side rear tire. It was a small, unnatural shape half sunk in the muck. It wasn't rock or submerged wood. It had a specific manufactured glint. Alex paused his survey, hovering over the spot. He unclipped a small, bristled brush from his harness. Holding his breath, a useless but instinctive gesture, he gently fanned the water above the object, clearing away the loosest layer of silt. Then, with painstaking care, he began to brush away the heavier sediment that encased it. The shape was metallic, with a distinct, sharp-edged geometry. It was a star. With a final, delicate whisk of the brush, the object came fully into view, gleaming under his light. It was a U.S. Marshals badge. It was remarkably preserved, the dark blue enamel in the lettering still vibrant against the polished metal. He leaned in closer, his faceplate almost touching the cold silt. He could read the engraved text. Senior Marshal, it said at the top, and at the bottom, a name, Thomas Slade. It was the badge of the ranking officer, the veteran of the crew. A cold, hard knot formed in Alex's stomach. The discovery of the badge should have been a confirmation, a piece of the puzzle falling into place, but its location made no sense. It was outside the vehicle, lying in the open. He marked the location with a small numbered evidence flag, pushing its wire leg carefully into the silt next to the badge. Why would Slade's badge be out here? Had he been thrown from the truck as it sank? That seemed unlikely, given the slow, controlled nature of the descent that the vehicle's condition implied. Did he get out on the surface, perhaps during a struggle on the quarry edge, and it fell from his belt? Or was he outside the vehicle when it went into the water? The questions multiplied, each one chipping away at the established story. Marshals did not simply lose their badges. It was a part of them, a symbol of their authority and their identity. For it to be here in the mud suggested a moment of chaos, of struggle, that wasn't apparent on the vehicle itself. It was the first piece of concrete evidence recovered from the site in 26 years, and it explained nothing. It only deepened the enigma. Alex stared at the small metal star, a beacon of confusion in the crushing dark. It was a piece of a man, separated from his tomb. It suggested that Senior Marshal Slade's final moments were not spent inside the steel walls of TRU 7. And if he wasn't in the truck, where was he? And why was his badge the only thing left behind? He felt a sudden urgent need to get this to the surface, to show them that this case was not just cold, it was twisted into a shape nobody had ever imagined. Breaking the surface was a violent sensory transition. The silent, pressurized world of the deep gave way to a cacophony of sound. The roar of the generator, the shouts of the surface crew, the slap of waves against the dive platform. The sudden weight of his gear, so neutral in the water, felt immense and oppressive in the open air. He pulled himself onto the platform, and hands immediately helped him remove his fins and helmet. The cool, crisp air felt sharp in his lungs after the canned, recycled gas of the rebreather. He blinked against the bright midday sun, his eyes struggling to adjust. Agent Riley, the younger of the two FBI agents, was there waiting, his face an impatient mask of bureaucratic authority. He was clean-shaven, wore a crisp windbreaker, and looked profoundly out of place against the rugged backdrop of the quarry. "What did you find, Kincaid?" Riley's tone was clipped, demanding data, not narrative. "Is the vehicle compromised? Can we begin planning the lift?" Alex pulled a small waterproof evidence container from a pouch on his harness. He didn't speak immediately, letting the agent's impatience hang in the air. He carefully unlatched the container and held it out. Lying on a bed of foam was Senior Marshal Thomas Slade's badge, the water from the quarry beading on its metal surface like cold sweat. "I found this," Alex said, his voice flat. Riley took the container, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. He turned it over in his hands, his professional composure momentarily cracking. This was real. This was the first tangible link to the vanished men in 26 years. The other agent, a senior, quieter man named Peterson, moved closer to look. "Slade's," Peterson murmured, his voice heavy with the weight of the discovery. So he was outside the vehicle. Riley's focus snapped back, or the door was open when it went in, or it was torn off him in a struggle on the surface before they were all disposed of. He was already fitting the evidence into the established narrative, the one that made sense on paper. "The vehicle shows no signs of a struggle," Alex stated, pulling off his gloves. "There are no bullet holes. There's no external damage consistent with an ambush or a fight. It looks like it was driven into the water." Riley frowned, his gaze shifting from the badge to Alex. He didn't like having his theories contradicted by a diver. "You're a salvage operator, Kincaid. Let our forensics team determine what the evidence means. Your job is to assess the structural integrity of the vehicle for recovery." The dismissal was clear in his voice. Alex felt a familiar surge of frustration. He had seen it before, the way officials could hold a piece of the truth in their hands and refuse to see what it was telling them. The badge's location, combined with the pristine condition of the truck, pointed to something far stranger than a simple ambush. "Agent," Alex said, meeting his gaze. "The narrative doesn't fit the scene. A professional hit, a chaotic abduction. It would be violent, messy. The truck down there, it's quiet. It feels methodical. The badge being outside, pristine like that, it feels less like it was torn off and more like it was dropped." Peterson looked at Alex, a flicker of genuine curiosity in his eyes. But Riley was already shaking his head, his mind closed. "It's a crime scene that's been submerged for 26 years. We can't make assumptions based on feelings. We need to get that vehicle out of the water. That is the priority." He turned to a state police officer. "Log the evidence. Get it to the lab. I want a full report on my desk by morning." Alex stood there as they took the badge, the first key to a 26-year-old mystery, and immediately began filing it away into a preconceived box. He knew that the most critical evidence was likely still sealed inside that truck, inside a tomb that the bureaucracy was now focused on dragging to the surface with industrial cranes. That approach was clumsy. It would destroy the context of the scene, potentially compromising whatever secrets were still preserved within. He had to convince them to let him look inside before the lift. "You need to let me go back down," Alex said, his voice low but firm. "Not just for a structural survey. You need to let me see inside. I can use the ROV, breach a window or a door with minimal disturbance. See what's in there before you haul it out and the entire context is lost." Riley turned back, his expression a mixture of annoyance and suspicion. "That is not protocol. We secure the scene, we recover the primary evidence, and we analyze it in a controlled environment. The environment down there is the controlled environment, Alex countered, his voice rising slightly. It's a perfect time capsule. The second you break those seals on the surface, you contaminate everything. Let me use the submersible's camera. Let me be your eyes. We need to know what we're dealing with before we move it. A long moment of silence passed between them. Peterson put a hand on Riley's arm. He has a point, Mark. A look inside could change the entire recovery plan. It might even be a booby trap, for all we know. Better to be cautious. Riley stared at Alex, a cold calculation in his eyes. He didn't like it, but the older agent's logic was sound. Fine, he conceded. The word clipped. Go down. Use your remote submersible. But you do not enter the vehicle. You breach one point of entry. You insert a camera, and you record. That's it. Any deviation, and I'll have your permit pulled for good. Alex simply nodded, turning to his gear. He had his opening, and he had a growing certainty that what was inside TRU-7 would blow their neat, orderly investigation wide open. The second descent felt different. The initial exploration had been a search into the unknown, but this was a targeted mission, heavy with the weight of expectation and the resistance he had felt on the surface. Alex descended more quickly this time, the path to the sunken truck now a familiar route through the crushing dark. He stabilized his position a few feet above the vehicle's roof, the silt he kicked up swirling around the silent hulk like a restless spirit. Tethered to the dive platform on the surface was the ROV, a compact, powerful submersible the size of a large suitcase, its fiber-optic umbilical cord spooling out behind it as the surface crew lowered it toward him. He caught the drone, its twin thrusters whirring softly, and guided it toward the rear doors of the transport. The ROV, which he called Leo, was an extension of his own senses, equipped with a high-definition camera, powerful lights, and a multifunction manipulator arm. Today, that arm was fitted with a hydraulic pincer, a tool designed for cutting, not finesse. He settled Leo on the roof of the truck and switched his perspective to the ROV's camera feed, displayed on a small screen strapped to his forearm. The view was startlingly clear, a bright, focused image that made the deep water gloom retreat. From the surface, Agent Riley's voice crackled in his earpiece, tinny and remote. "We have your feed, Kincaid. You are cleared to approach the rear door. Proceed with caution." Alex didn't reply. He maneuvered the ROV off the roof and positioned it directly in front of the heavy-duty lock on the vehicle's back doors. The plan was to bypass the lock entirely and use the pincers to snap the hinges, a form of brute force entry that Riley had reluctantly approved. The hinges were thick, rusted steel, but the hydraulics of the manipulator arm were powerful. Alex extended the arm, the mechanical limb moving with a smooth, deliberate grace. The steel pincers closed around the upper hinge. He engaged the hydraulics. The ROV's motors whined in protest as the arm strained against the corroded metal. A cloud of rust particles erupted from the hinge, and a deep groaning sound echoed through the water, a sound he felt in his chest cavity. The hinge resisted, holding fast for a long, tense moment. Then, with a sudden, violent snap that vibrated through the truck's frame, the metal gave way. He repeated the process on the lower hinge. It too resisted, then broke with a screech of tortured steel. The right side door was now held only by the central locking mechanism. It was time for the final push. He repositioned the ROV, placing its manipulator arm flat against the center of the door. "Riley, I'm about to apply pressure to the door," Alex reported, his voice calm. "It should swing inward." "Acknowledged," came the disembodied reply. Alex eased the ROV's thrusters forward, pushing the arm against the door. For a moment, nothing happened. The seal, hardened by decades of pressure and corrosion, held firm. He increased the thrust. The door groaned, a low, guttural sound of metal yielding. Then, with a great shuddering heave, the seal broke. The door swung inward into the blackness of the prisoner compartment, and a dense, opaque cloud of black, stagnant water billowed out, completely obscuring the camera's view. It was the air from 26 years ago, a trapped breath finally exhaled. Alex held the ROV steady, waiting for the vortex of ancient water and disturbed sediment to clear. The seconds stretched into an eternity. He could hear the tense breathing of the agents on the surface over his comms. Slowly, agonizingly, the view began to resolve. The ROV's light pierced the gloom, illuminating the interior. The compartment was small, a steel box. He could see the prisoner's bench, the shackles bolted to the floor, and then he saw it. This was the first great twist in the story, the moment the entire narrative of the last 26 years pivoted on its axis. The prisoner compartment was supposed to contain the remains of Julian Croft. It didn't. It was empty. But it wasn't completely empty. On the floor of the compartment, directly in the center of the camera's view, lay 3 objects. First, a set of leg irons, unlocked, lying discarded as if their wearer had simply stood up and walked away. Second, beside them, a standard set of Marshals handcuffs, also unlocked. But it was the third object that made the breath catch in Alex's throat. It was a shoe, a small white sneaker with a single faded red stripe along the side. It was impossibly clean, preserved by the oxygen-deprived water. It was a child's shoe. Alex stared at the image on his monitor, his mind struggling to process the information. The prisoner was gone. The cuffs were unlocked, and there was evidence of a child, a small child, who had never been part of the story. The official record listed 3 marshals and 1 male prisoner. There was no mention, no hint of a child. A sharp, static-filled voice burst in his ear. "Kincaid, what is that? What are we looking at?" It was Riley, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence, now thin and reedy with shock. Alex couldn't answer. He just stared at the impossible sight on his screen. A child's shoe in a federal transport's prisoner cage. This wasn't a mob hit. This wasn't a simple abduction. This was something else entirely. Something colder and more complex than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The single small shoe had just rewritten the entire mystery. The truck was not just a tomb for 4 men, it was the silent witness to a secret no one even knew existed. The image of the child's shoe was burned into Alex's mind, a stark white anomaly against the dark steel floor. "Kincaid, report," Riley's voice insisted, a sharp edge of command returning, though it was frayed with confusion. Alex took a slow, deliberate breath, the recycled air tasting flat and sterile. "The prisoner compartment is empty," he said, his voice a low monotone forcing the words out. "There are 2 sets of restraints on the floor, both unlocked, and there is a child's shoe." The silence on the other end of the comms was more eloquent than any response. He could almost hear the gears turning in their heads, the established facts of the case shattering like glass. This discovery didn't just add a new piece to the puzzle, it threw the entire puzzle board into the fire. "Maneuver the ROV for a wider view," Peterson's calmer voice cut in. "Sweep the entire interior of the compartment, slowly." Alex complied, his hands moving with practiced steadiness on the ROV's controls, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his own thoughts. A child. Where had a child come from? He piloted Leo through the open doorway, the vehicle's lights flooding the small, cramped space. It was a sterile, featureless box, approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, with a single steel bench running along one wall. There was nothing else. No bloodstains visible under the layer of silt, no signs of a struggle, nothing but the restraints and the shoe. The scene was as clean and methodical as the exterior of the truck. It felt staged. Having documented the prisoner cage, he carefully navigated the ROV through the interior passage that connected the rear compartment to the main cabin. This was the most delicate part of the operation, the small drone moving through a narrow space it was never designed to enter. The fiber-optic tether, his lifeline to the surface, dragged behind it, and Alex was acutely aware that snagging it on a piece of debris could mean losing the multi-million-dollar machine. The passage was dark and short. As the ROV emerged into the front of the vehicle, the view changed. This was where the Marshals had spent their final moments. The driver's and passengers' seats were empty, their vinyl upholstery split and rotted in the water. The dashboard was a landscape of decay, gauges clouded with moisture, the plastic cracked and warped. A standard-issue shotgun was still locked in its vertical rack between the 2 front seats. This was another impossibility. In any kind of ambush scenario, that shotgun would have been the first thing the Marshals reached for. Its presence, still secured, was another loud testament to the absence of a fight. His light swept across the floor, which was littered with the mundane debris of a road trip, preserved in eerie perfection. A crumpled fast food bag, a thermos lying on its side, a scattering of maps. It was a scene of placid normality, violently interrupted. Then, the ROV's light fell on the steering column. The keys to 207 were still in the ignition. They dangled from a simple metal ring, swaying gently in the current created by the ROV's thrusters. "We have keys in the ignition," Alex reported, his voice tight. The vehicle wasn't hot-wired. It was driven here and turned off. He maneuvered the ROV closer, zooming the camera in on the keys. They were covered in the same fine layer of grime and sediment as everything else, but something about the way the light hit the surface of the main key caught his eye. There, preserved in the thin, greasy film of decomposition, was a pattern, a faint, whirled impression, a fingerprint. It was faint, but under the high-definition gaze of the ROV's camera, it was unmistakable. It was on the bow of the ignition key, exactly where someone's thumb would rest when turning off the engine. "Riley Peterson, are you seeing this?" Alex asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The ignition key. There's a print. We see it," Riley confirmed, his voice hushed with awe. "Incredible. The anaerobic environment, the lack of current, it's been perfectly preserved." This was a piece of evidence that could directly identify the last person to drive the truck. It could be Julian Croft, the prisoner, or it could be one of the Marshals, or it could be someone else entirely. An unknown player in this deepening conspiracy. The implications were staggering. "There's something else," Alex said, panning the camera slightly to the right, toward the passenger seat. Lying on the seat, partially obscured by the shotgun rack, was a second set of keys. These were smaller, not for the vehicle. They looked like standard-issue government keys, the kind used for desks, for lockers, for secure rooms. They were unlogged, unmentioned in any report on the Marshals' standard equipment. And on the surface of one of those keys, another faint, perfect fingerprint glistened in the ROV's light. 2 sets of keys, 2 prints. The prisoner's fingerprints would be on file, but so would the Marshals'. This was evidence that could either confirm the official story or condemn one of the vanished officers. The conspiracy was no longer just a theory. It was a tangible reality, and it was beginning to feel like it had originated from within the truck itself. Alex held the ROV steady, letting the camera capture the silent, damning evidence. The keys, the prints, and the impossible shoe. This truck was not just a grave, it was a meticulously arranged crime scene. The discovery of the fingerprints had electrified the surface team, transforming their bureaucratic caution into a feverish hunger for more evidence. Riley's orders came through the comms with a new, sharp urgency. "Kincaid, the communications equipment. Find their radio. That's the priority now. If there's any recoverable data, we need it." Alex acknowledged the command and began a systematic search of the driver's cabin with the ROV. The primary radio console was set into the dashboard, a complex piece of 1990s technology that looked ancient and alien. It was battered, its faceplate cracked, and Alex knew its delicate internal electronics would be hopelessly corroded. But there was a secondary unit, a mobile data terminal with a more robust self-contained memory, bolted to the transmission hump. It was this device that held the most promise. He maneuvered the ROV into position, the manipulator arm extending toward the terminal. The bolts holding it to the floor mount were rusted solid. Snapping them would be easy, but the resulting shock could damage the device's fragile internal components. He had to be careful. Using the fine-tipped gripper attachment on the manipulator, he began to work on the bolts, slowly, patiently twisting them back and forth. The process was agonizingly slow, a form of underwater neurosurgery on a piece of corroded steel. Minutes stretched on, each one filled with the low whine of the ROV's servos and the sound of his own breathing. Finally, after what felt like an hour, the last bolt gave way. The terminal was free. Using the manipulator's main claw, he gently cradled the heavy device. Piloting the ROV out of the truck's cabin was even more stressful than going in. He was moving backward, dragging the precious data terminal and the long, vulnerable umbilical cord through the narrow passage. One wrong move, one snag on a seat spring or a piece of the dashboard, and the entire mission could end in failure. He moved inch by excruciating inch, his focus absolute. When the ROV finally cleared the rear door and emerged back into the open, silty water of the quarry, Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He secured the terminal in a specially designed recovery basket that the surface crew lowered to him, and watched as it began its slow journey to the world of air and light. He felt a profound sense of accomplishment, but it was tinged with dread. That box held a voice from the past, and he was not sure anyone was truly prepared for what it might say. Back on the dive platform, the atmosphere was electric. The forensics team, clad in white, clean suits that seemed absurdly out of place, immediately took possession of the recovered terminal. They rushed it to a mobile lab set up in a large tent near the quarry's edge. Alex, stripped down to his undersuit, stood by, an outsider to his own discovery. He watched through the clear plastic flap of the tent as they carefully disassembled the unit's casing, their movements precise and urgent. Riley and Peterson stood beside him, their earlier friction forgotten, united by the tense anticipation. Hours passed. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. Alex drank lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, the silence from the lab growing louder than any noise. Then, a technician emerged from the tent, holding a laptop. His face was pale. "We got something," he said, his voice strained. The primary solid-state memory chip was miraculously preserved in a watertight subcasing. Most of the data is corrupted, hopelessly degraded. But we were able to isolate a single audio fragment from the unit's automatic transmission buffer. He turned the laptop around. "It's the last thing the radio transmitted before it lost power. We've filtered it as best we can, but the quality is terrible." He clicked a button on the screen. A burst of static filled the air, harsh and abrasive. Then, through the noise, a voice. It was distorted, high-pitched with stress, but it was undeniably human. It was a man shouting, his words fractured by static and panic. "Serial 7889er. I repeat, this is not an ambush. This is God. It's Miller. It's Chen. They have the fragment ended abruptly in a burst of static, followed by a sound that the audio technician identified as the terminal's microphone striking a hard surface, and then silence. A profound, chilling silence fell over the small group. Alex felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He looked at Riley, whose face had gone ashen. This wasn't the voice of a man fighting off mobsters. This was the voice of a man betrayed. The serial number was a Marshals badge number. It was Senior Marshal Thomas Slade's badge number. He hadn't been calling for help against an outside threat. He was reporting on his own partners. "It's Miller. It's Chen." The names of the other two marshals, spoken not as comrades but as a warning. The final, garbled words, "They have hung in the air," an unfinished sentence that now seemed to point directly to the one piece of evidence that made no sense. The child's shoe. The fragment wasn't just a clue. It was a dying declaration. It was the sound of a conspiracy unfolding from the inside, a story of betrayal and murder committed not by a crime syndicate, but by the very men sworn to uphold the law. The case had just turned inside out. The recovery of the audio fragment transformed the operation. The quarry was no longer just a cold case site. It was the active crime scene of a federal officer's murder, perpetrated by his own colleagues. The FBI presence swelled overnight. The quiet, methodical pace was replaced by the urgent, overwhelming force of a full-scale federal investigation. Massive cranes, their yellow arms stark against the gray sky, arrived and positioned themselves at the quarry's edge. The lift was happening, and it was happening now. Alex's role was officially over, but Agent Riley, his demeanor now one of sober respect, asked him to remain on-site as a consultant. They needed his intimate knowledge of the wreck's condition as it was brought to the surface. He stood on the shore, a silent observer, as divers attached thick steel cables to the chassis of TO-7. The extraction was a slow, monstrously powerful process. The crane engines roared to life, their diesel fumes thick in the air. The cables went taut, straining against the immense weight of the waterlogged vehicle. For a moment, the truck refused to budge, held fast by the suction of the silt. Then, with a great sucking groan, it broke free. Water cascaded from its frame as it rose from the depths, a leviathan being dragged unwillingly into the light. It breached the surface, trailing strands of algae and shedding rivers of brown water, and hung suspended in the air, dripping its secrets onto the stone below. It looked smaller in the open air, more vulnerable, a rusted, pathetic relic. It was carefully, painstakingly lowered onto a massive flatbed truck, the entire area cordoned off with yellow tape. The tomb had been opened. Forensics teams swarmed the vehicle, their work beginning immediately under the harsh glare of portable floodlights that pushed back the encroaching dusk. Alex watched from the perimeter with Riley and Peterson, the three of them bound by the terrible knowledge of what the truck contained. The initial findings, relayed to them over the radio by the lead forensic investigator, came in a steady, bewildering stream. Each new discovery was a contradiction, a piece of a puzzle that refused to form a coherent image. They confirmed Senior Marshal Slade's fingerprint was not on the steering wheel, but Marshal Miller's was. It was Miller who had driven the truck into the quarry. They found Slade's sidearm, a standard-issue Glock, wedged between the driver's seat and the center console. It had been fired once. A single spent shell casing was recovered from the floor mat on the driver's side. Here was the contradiction. The bullet had been fired inside the cabin, but a meticulous scan of the truck's interior showed no corresponding exit hole. There was no shattered window, no hole in the dashboard, no damage to the roof or doors. The bullet, it seemed, had never left the cabin. Then they found it. The forensic team, using an alternate light source, discovered a small repaired hole in the back of the driver's seat and a corresponding impact mark on the steel partition that separated the cabin from the prisoner compartment. The bullet's trajectory was clear. Someone sitting in the passenger seat had fired the weapon. The bullet had traveled through the back of the driver's seat and struck the man piloting the vehicle. Thomas Slade had not been outside the truck. He had been shot from behind by one of his own men while he was driving. The pieces began to fall into a horrifying new order. Slade was driving. Miller, the ambitious young marshal, was in the passenger seat. Chen, the quiet firearms expert, was likely in the back, with the prisoner, Julian Croft, and the unknown child. Miller shoots Slade from the passenger seat, killing him instantly. He then takes the wheel, leaving his own fingerprint on the ignition key, and drives the truck to the prearranged spot at the quarry's edge. He stops the vehicle, turns off the engine, and then they all exit, leaving the keys behind. But why? The motive was still a gaping hole in the theory. And Slade's badge, how did it end up 10 feet from the truck in the mud? As if on cue, a call came over Riley's radio. A secondary search team, doing a final sweep of the area where Alex had found the badge, had discovered something else buried deeper in the silt. It was a single Marshal-issue boot. Based on the size and wear, it was consistent with being Slade's. It appeared that after killing him, Miller and Chen had dragged Slade's body from the vehicle before sinking it, likely to dispose of it elsewhere. The badge must have fallen off during that process. They had tried to erase him completely, but in their haste they had left behind the two small things that would ultimately tell his story, his badge and his boot. The picture was now one of cold, calculated murder and betrayal. The only questions remaining were the biggest of all. Why did they do it, and what happened to the prisoner, the two rogue marshals, and the child with the single white shoe? A week later, Alex found himself in a sterile, windowless conference room at the FBI's regional headquarters. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and quiet grief. Agent Riley had requested his presence at the briefing for the Marshals' families, a gesture Alex initially resisted but ultimately accepted. He felt a strange responsibility, a connection to the men he had only known as ghosts in a sunken machine. Across the long, polished table sat the living relics of that 26-year-old tragedy. There was Eleanor Slade, a woman in her late 70s, her face a mask of dignified sorrow, clutching the hand of her middle-aged son. There was Sarah Miller, who had been a young wife with 2 toddlers in 1999. Her children, now adults, sat beside her, their expressions a mixture of anger and confusion. And there was the brother of Robert Chen, a quiet man who bore a striking resemblance to the photograph Alex had seen in the case file. They had lived for 26 years with the story of their heroic husbands, fathers, and brothers who had vanished fighting the good fight. Today, that story was going to be systematically dismantled. Riley stood at the head of the table, his demeanor somber and respectful. He laid out the findings with a detached, clinical precision, sparing them the most graphic details but omitting none of the core facts. He spoke of the vehicle's condition, the absence of an external fight, the discovery of the child's shoe. He detailed the ballistic evidence, Slade's weapon being used inside the cabin, the bullet's trajectory, the fact that it was fired from the passenger seat. He explained the fingerprint evidence, placing Marshal Miller behind the wheel in the final moments. Alex watched their faces as the information settled. He saw the flicker of disbelief in Sarah Miller's eyes, the way her son's hand clenched into a fist on the table. He saw the deep, weary resignation in Eleanor Slade's expression, as if some part of her had always suspected the truth was darker than the legend. The Chen family remained impassive, their faces unreadable. Then came the final, devastating blow. "We were able to fully restore the audio from the recovered data terminal," Riley said, his voice dropping. "We have Senior Marshal Slade's final transmission." He paused, letting the weight of the moment fill the room. This was the second, and most terrible, twist in the tale. The full audio file, scrubbed clean of static, did not end where the fragment had. It contained a few more crucial seconds of audio. Riley played it. Slade's voice, now terrifyingly clear in the silent room, filled the air. "Mayday! Mayday, this is Marshal Slade, badge 7889er. I repeat, this is not an ambush. This is God. It's Miller. It's Chen. They're not taking him to witness protection. They're selling him. They have the boy, God. They have the witness's son." The recording ended with a sharp crack, the sound of the gunshot, followed by the thud of the radio hitting the floor. A single, heartbroken sob escaped from Eleanor Slade. The heroic myth shattered completely, replaced by a squalid, horrifying reality. It wasn't about fighting the mob. It was about greed. Julian Croft wasn't just a high-value witness. He was a high-ranking syndicate accountant who had agreed to testify in exchange for a new life for himself and his young son under the Witness Protection Program. Miller and Chen, the two men entrusted with their safety, had seen a more lucrative opportunity. They had cut a deal with the very syndicate they were supposed to be fighting, agreeing to sell Croft and his son back to them for an astronomical sum. Senior Marshal Slade, the veteran, the man on the verge of retirement, had figured it out too late. He had tried to stop them, and they had murdered him for it. The rest of the story, Riley explained, was pieced together from newly reopened financial records. 2 months after the disappearance, large, untraceable deposits had appeared in offshore accounts, linked to shell corporations that were, in turn, secretly controlled by Miller and Chen's families. The two rogue marshals had successfully sold their charges, collected their blood money, and, with their families, had likely vanished to start new lives under new identities, funded by their betrayal. Julian Croft and his son were almost certainly executed by the mob, shortly after being handed over. The single white shoe was the only trace the boy had left on the world. Alex looked at the faces of the families, now fractured into two distinct groups. On one side, the family of a murdered hero grappling with the knowledge that his killers were his own partners. On the other, the families of two traitors and murderers, their entire lives revealed as a lie built on a foundation of unimaginable corruption. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the weight of secrets that had festered for a quarter of a century. The truth had finally surfaced, but it offered no comfort, no clean resolution. It was just a different, more painful kind of haunting. 2 months later, the Greer limestone quarry was quiet again. The chain-link fence and no trespassing signs were gone, the circus of media vans and FBI vehicles a fading memory. The water had settled back into its placid, inscrutable state, its surface a mirror for the autumn sky. The only visible evidence of the frantic activity was a set of deep tire ruts in the earth where the cranes had stood, scars that would take years to heal. Alex Kincaid stood at the water's edge, the same spot where he had prepared for his first descent. He was not in a dry suit today, just a simple jacket against the cool afternoon breeze. He was here not as an operator, but as a man seeking closure. The case of the vanished Marshals was officially closed. The FBI had issued international warrants for David Miller and Robert Chen, though everyone knew it was a formality. With a 26-year head start and millions of dollars, they were ghosts, long gone. The syndicate they had sold their souls to had been dismantled years ago by other means, its leaders either dead or in prison, leaving no one to corroborate the final grim details of what happened to Julian Croft and his son. The story had faded from the headlines, replaced by new tragedies and new mysteries, leaving only the quiet devastation of the families involved. The Slades were petitioning to have their father's name added to the National Law Enforcement Officer's memorial, not as a victim of a mob hit, but as an officer killed in the line of duty by internal conspiracy. The Millers and Chens had disappeared from their homes, swallowed by the shame and the legal fallout of the recovered funds. Alex tossed a small, flat stone into the quarry, watching the ripples spread and vanish. He thought about the truck, now sitting in a climate-controlled FBI evidence warehouse, a dissected corpse under permanent sterile light. He thought about the child's shoe, a tiny object that had carried the weight of the entire truth. The case had consumed him for weeks, but the resolution brought no sense of triumph. There was no thrill of the chase, no satisfaction in victory. There was only the heavy, somber feeling of having dragged a painful, ugly truth into the light. He had answered the mystery, but the answer was just another form of pain. He had learned that secrets don't die. They just wait, submerged in the cold and the dark, for someone to find them. His gaze drifted across the water, and for the first time in years, he allowed the memory of his final Coast Guard mission to surface without pushing it back down. He saw the churning grey water of the Atlantic, felt the sting of the spray, and saw the face of the fisherman whose hand had slipped from his grasp. For so long that failure had defined him, had driven him into the silent, controlled world of salvage diving. He had been searching for something he could hold on to, something he could bring back, a success to balance the scale of his failure. In finding TRU-7, he had done it. He had brought back the truth, as terrible as it was. He hadn't saved anyone, but he had given a murdered man his story back. He had given a name to the evil that had been allowed to fester for a generation. He realized that the unease that had haunted him, the constant, low-grade hum of anxiety, was quieter now. It wasn't gone, but it had receded. The solution to the 26-year-old mystery hadn't been a moment of brilliant deduction or a flash of insight. It had been the product of ordinary courage and methodical work. It was the courage of Thomas Slade, who made a final desperate radio call. It was the patience of the forensic techs, the focus of the investigators, and his own steady descent into the cold. The mystery was solved by people simply doing their jobs, even when the truth they uncovered was the last thing anyone wanted to see. Alex turned away from the water. The quarry could keep its silence. He had found what he needed to, not just for the sake of the dead, but for himself. The ghosts of the past would never fully leave, but he no longer felt like he was drowning with them. He had finally found his way back to the surface.